Thank you guys for joining us this morning. I consider us very lucky to have Haviv join us. There was a group of us that went on a staff trip to Israel in 2018, and we got to spend some time with Haviv, and I think most people would tell you that we wish we had had more time. We ended up having to kind of cut it short because there was so much discussion and people just really enjoying the perspective that Haviv was able to tell the story with, that he was giving us, the information that he was giving and the way he gave it. So welcome to Memphis in a way, Haviv. And as we've discussed, I hope one day you'll actually physically be in Memphis. Let me first introduce. Haviv Gur is a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as a senior analyst at the Times of Israel. He has covered Israeli politics and the country's foreign and regional policies, as well as its fraught relationship with the Jewish diaspora since 2005. He has reported from over 20 countries, is fluent in Hebrew and English, and is a sought-after lecturer in Israel and abroad on Israeli society and history, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and more. He served as Director of Communications for the Jewish Agency for Israel, Israel's largest NGO, and was an early advocate and lobbyist for Space.il, the nonprofit working to advance science and space education in Israel's schools. He teaches history and politics at prestigious Israeli pre-military academies. So for anyone who wasn't on just a minute ago, Haviv is going to speak for just a little while, and then because we're a small-ish group, larger than one of my previous discussions that we had, we'll open it up to questions. At that point, I'll just unmute everyone, and we'll just do our best not to talk over each other. So I'm going to turn it over now to Haviv.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. These are, strange circumstances. So it's good that we're pursuing the human connection across this weird time and this technology. We're having this call at a very, very interesting moment, not planned. Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu in the last hour after, the last Knesset voted to dissolve itself in November 2018. The first election was in April 2019. September 2019 was the second election. The third election was in March. And final agreement on a unity government between Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz happened on April 6th, Monday in the afternoon, Israel time, which is to say just now. There you have an agreement on the two major issues that were dividing them in the coalition talks for the last month, namely annexation in the West Bank. Would there be? What would it look like? Would it be essentially theater, or would it be something significant? And the other issue is how you appoint judges, which is a very, very significant question in Israel. Judicial appointments affects the politicization of the court. One of the major agendas of the Israeli right is to rein in Israel's judiciary. And one of the major goals and ideals, certainly of Benny Gantz, is to strengthen Israel's judiciary. We have a very strange system of government. It's very similar to Italy's. Like Italy, it's also very unstable, and we don't actually have a lot of division of power. Our parliament produces our government. Our prime minister is a member of parliament, so the executive and parliamentary branch aren't very divided. And we essentially have a very strong court system that sort of sits outside all of that and reins it in with powers that very few other courts in the world have. So we have a very, very strong court, and a debate between right and left on how strong the court should be. And that's a major part of the coalition talks. It looks like Blue and White won on the question of the courts, and Likud won on the question of annexation. All of that is to say, sometime in the next 3 months, Israel is probably going to declare some sort of annexation in the West Bank. You could like it, you can hate it. I'm just here to tell you that's something that was agreed on in the last day. I want to say a couple of very sort of fast points and then open it up. We've seen over the last year that Benny Gantz, the head of Blue and White, if, by the way, there's something I'm saying that's unclear, some term, some person you haven't heard of, just shout out in 10 minutes or maybe even in 5 minutes. Benny Gantz has turned out to be a very, very significant and very, very sharp and very impressive political operator. He built a coalition of the Israeli center, of the Israeli left, a coalition that hasn't existed essentially since the Second Intifada. I don't know if whoever was on the trip 2 years ago, we spoke about the Second Intifada, and we spoke about how the Second Intifada that began in the autumn of 2000, you can track very clear numbers. I think I talked at the time about voter turnout, but you can measure many other measures of what Israelis want to vote, what they think they're voting for, how they prioritize their politics. Arab Israeli turnout, Arab Israeli participation, Arab Israeli feelings of involvement and belonging and integration in Israeli society. And in all of these measures that you could imagine, the Second Intifada, the beginning of this massive wave of suicide bombings that just exploded in Israel's cities and in Israel's psyche, beginning around 2000 to 2003, changed everything. It really changed everything. The Israeli left hasn't won an election since 1999, since the election before the Second Intifada. And we have just seen Benny Gantz build a coalition that looked sociologically, the views were more centrist, but the actual groups of people, the actual participants in the Blue and White Alliance and the Blue and White Party, the secularists, the places they live in, the places they voted from, some of their issues on domestic questions, not the Palestinians or security or foreign policy, but on questions of religion and state, on questions of gay rights, on some of these questions that came up during the campaign, you really saw a reforging of the Israeli left that we had known. Again, with a much more skeptical, a much more centrist Israeli left on questions of security, Palestinians, Iran, but on all of the social issues, definitely Israeli left. And Benny Gantz put together this coalition by bringing in and sort of, the expression herding cats. I don't know if that's an expression in English, it's an expression in Hebrew. Herding cats is something, it's very hard to herd cats because they're solitary creatures. He got 3 former chiefs of staff of the army, he's one of them, and a man named Yair Lapid, who runs the Yesh Atid party, which has maybe the most competent, expansive, activist, and well-organized ground operation of all Israeli political parties. He puts them all together as a group and pushes them, pushes them forward through 3 elections. They remain loyal. They deny Netanyahu a victory twice. And in the 3rd time, they were still denying Netanyahu a victory when Benny Gantz suddenly split away from Blue and White because of the coronavirus crisis, which has shut down the Israeli economy. 1/4 of Israeli workers have lost their jobs. And now Benny Gantz sort of broke up that alliance and went and started to negotiate a coalition agreement. Holding that together for a year is unprecedented in Israeli politics. That kind of jump and then beginning to negotiate with Netanyahu was also incredibly smart. And a lot of people have criticized Gantz on moral grounds. He ran a campaign explaining that more or less on the agenda of ousting Netanyahu. And then about 2 weeks after the election, he then breaks apart his own centrist coalition and goes with Netanyahu. If you want to argue that that's immoral, it's violating his promise to his voters, that is a legitimate argument. When I say it's smart, I mean he did it in a way that ensured that Netanyahu couldn't run away with the prize. Blue and White is broken up. He no longer can really challenge Netanyahu in a 4th election. He didn't want to reach a 4th election. The coronavirus, the crisis really has caused a debilitating stoppage of the Israeli economy, of Israeli society. He wants an emergency government. He wants political stability. He said openly, if this is the end of me politically, but it delivers Israel stability, that's great. And then he did something extremely clever and that had never been done before in the history of Israel. He is a candidate for prime minister. He has the president's mandate to form a coalition. The president picks one of the MKs I realize I'm doing a lot of hand motions, and I don't know if you can see the hand motions. And as an Israeli, I don't want to deny anyone my hand motions. So he has this mandate from the president, and he then gets himself elected, he goes to Netanyahu and he says, I'm going to break up blue and white. I'm going to go into coalition talks with you. And there's one thing you're going to do for me before the coalition talks begin so that you don't stab me in the back the day after. Because, frankly, Netanyahu is capable and has in the past with Shaul Mofaz of Kadima in 2009. This is something that has happened and has happened more than once. I'm sorry, in 2013. He said, you're going to elect me Knesset Speaker. And from the position of Knesset Speaker, he's now Speaker of the Knesset, I am going to negotiate a coalition with you. This is the first time in Israel's history that a candidate for prime minister was first elected himself Knesset Speaker. A Knesset Speaker is a fascinating place to be. You have control over the agenda of the plenary of the Knesset, which means that the government can't pass a budget, the government can't pass really any legislation that it needs. A government can't survive more than 3 or 4 months if a Knesset Speaker decides it's time for the government to fall. At the same time, it's almost impossible to unseat a Knesset Speaker. You need 90 members of Knesset out of 120. Netanyahu doesn't have 90. Even now, the coalition agreement that it looks like he signed, they haven't literally signed yet, so anything could happen, but there is a final agreement as of the last hour. It's about a 77-seat coalition, and that's this massive unity government nobody has imagined in decades. So to reach 90 to oust him is almost impossible. Netanyahu now, Gantz gave up the political vehicle with which he could have challenged Netanyahu in a new election, but he also held the Knesset ransom, so Netanyahu had to negotiate. Ladies and gentlemen, Benny Gantz is quiet, gentle, soft-spoken, polite man, and somehow rose to become the commander of the Israeli military, and left for politics, and suddenly, quietly, gently, people have mocked him for not having the rhetorical skills, the oratory, the pizzazz, the marketing, the campaign skills. His campaign was constantly leaking embarrassing leaks. Gently, quietly, he made sure to keep all the egos in check, built up his vehicle, pushed it through 3 elections, leaped at the right moment, but not before making sure he's elected Speaker of the Knesset, and now has pushed Netanyahu into a position where it looks like they're going to have a unity government. Everything I said is unprecedented. Benny Gantz deserves credit. To tell you that Benjamin Netanyahu is a brilliant political operator and also a very ruthless political operator who manages to convince the Israeli right that he's absolutely necessary while also convincing the Israeli left that he's the only thing standing between, democracy and the right winning and becoming fascist. He's managed to convince everyone of exactly what they need to know about him. And these 2 people are about to piece together a coalition that is going to be very chaotic. We're going to go now into an Israeli government whose main job is to bring political stability, to not fight, to not scream, to not throw each other's bills out of the plenary, to make sure things run smoothly, because the country now has to deal with the biggest economic crisis it's ever seen, and of course the shutdowns and the lockdowns and the virus. But it's a government that, because of the way they have patched together the coalition agreement, the party that has a ministry is the party that will decide policy for that ministry. This is a very important thing to understand. The defense ministry goes to Benny Gantz at the beginning of this government. Whenever it's sworn in, could be tomorrow, could be in a week. The defense ministry goes to Benny Gantz. The defense ministry will go to Benny Gantz, and it will be the government agency that has to implement the annexation, any annexation that's agreed on with Likud and that the government decides. In other words, even if the government votes to annex in the next 3 months, which is something Likud demanded, the actual annexation will be carried out by Benny Gantz, by the blue and white faction. So we're going to see a policy that's very, very mixed and confused. The Justice Ministry, which has a lot of influence over electing judges, a lot of influence over setting policy for prosecutors and things like that. Major point of contention in the Israeli political culture wars will be in the hands of blue and white. The communication ministry will be in blue and white. Expect policies for that party. Every ministry you go to, whether it's tourism, culture, foreign ministry, intelligence ministry, any ministry you go to, you will find that the party that controls it will run its policy. And what that means is that you will have ministries like, for example, welfare and the economy ministry, which is one of the major regulators of the economy, controlled by the Labour Party with Gantz, working with Gantz, they will run policies that are left-wing policies. So for example, in the West Bank, if you have settlements that need something from the transportation ministry to build a road, that'll be very forthcoming. The transportation ministry will be run by the right. But if it then wants to put out some kind of a tourism pamphlet and put that out on Israel's, on the sort of national tourism infrastructures board's advertising budgets, then the left wing running the tourism industry will tell them no. So you're going to have settlers who will know they can work with some ministries on some issues, but not with other ministries on other issues. You're going to have a government with a weirdly separate and disparate, different pieces doing different things. I don't know to tell you a great deal more about this coalition. I've been learning it for about 45 minutes, and let's say we open it up, and we'll go wherever you're interested in going. More into the weeds, or yeah.
Didn't unmute me. Okay, now we'll try this. Before we open it up to everyone, I just also want to point out and introduce, hopefully everyone here has met her at some point, Meitav Menachem, our community shlicha, is on this call as well. So after we're done, if you think of any follow-up questions you didn't think of during the call, please email her. Feel free to reach out, and if she knows the answer, she'll answer you. If not, we'll get it for you as best as we can. So I'm going to throw it out there. There are a couple of people who are still muted, so I think I can go through. I'm going to unmute everybody. If you want to mute yourself, go ahead, and we'll turn it over to the audience.
So and my question is the role of the speakers and the role that Mitch McConnell has in the current U.S. government.
Charlie, I didn't completely hear that. Something about the speaker in the U.S. government.
There's the head of the Republicans in the Senate, Mitch McConnell. And I'm wondering if Gantz's role is going to be like that.
It's it's a completely different system. The Speaker of the Israeli Knesset is a extraordinarily powerful position. In a sense, the American system has many, many, many speaker positions because a bill has to pass identically in the Senate and in the House, and the Senate and the House are not only elected on different schedules, they're elected by different sort of ways of cross-secting the society, and then the White House is on its own schedule, and they can veto or not sign, and then so you actually have many, many checks and balances and subdivisions of American society to prevent majorities and Federalist number 10 and all of this. But in the Israeli system, it's very, very simple. And part of the reason that our system is so chaotic is that the system itself is so simple. You have a parliament, 120 members of Knesset. By the way, per capita, one of the smaller parliaments in the world. I think Austria is the same population and has almost double the members of parliament. And out of those 120, one of them is selected by the president, always by tradition, not necessarily by law, but by tradition, after recommendations from a majority of members of Knesset, of the newly elected Knesset, to be prime minister. They then piece together a government, negotiate a government from the Knesset. The Knesset then has a majority of the Knesset votes to give that government its confidence, and then the government is in operation. And the Knesset can build committees and oversee things, and the Knesset has all the budgets obviously have to be passed in laws in the Knesset. The Knesset speaker has tremendous, tremendous power in the Israeli system because the Knesset speaker schedules votes in the plenary, which is to say, you need the 3 votes of approval to pass a budget law. You need 3 votes to pass any law. You need 4 votes to pass private member laws that don't have the support of the coalition and the government. And every one of those votes has to be scheduled by the speaker, and the speaker can delay those votes by a month and by 4 months and by 10 months until the political circumstances change. So the Israeli speaker is a bottleneck if they want to be, and they've only ever been in very, very specific circumstances. To remove a speaker is possible, but it requires an overwhelming majority of members of Knesset. In other words, it requires the entirety of the Knesset over any political disagreements to really feel this person is a terrible person. And that's where Benny Gantz had himself placed. the only way to get Benny Gantz out of the speaker position and to get things moving for the Netanyahu government at this point is for Benny Gantz to resign. And then you only need 61 votes to have the new speaker elected. And so that was the brilliance of that. I think that's much, much more powerful than Mitch McConnell. I don't know that Mitch McConnell can just hold up a vote on the federal budget for 4 months alone, without the rest of the caucus, without all the Republicans agreeing with him. I have to check it's the inner sort of regulations and statutes of how the actual parliament works. But I think of the Israeli Knesset speaker as one of the more powerful Knesset speakers in the democratic world.
Anybody else? And if make sure you're not muted, because it looks like some people may have muted themselves.
Excuse me. So let me move ahead to some other issues that came up during this election. One of the things we saw that was very interesting today, again, I had a very detailed, I don't know if you read the Times of Israel. I urge you to read the Times of Israel. That's my newspaper, and obviously click on all the ads. I did about 11 little bit long and wordy essays over the course of March on the developing political situation. And a lot of what is in those essays is no longer really true or relevant because of how this coalition agreement came about, and because Benny Gantz is now looks like he's actually negotiated a government. And so what the questions that come up now are really, really interesting questions. For example, one of the things that Benny Gantz managed to he essentially let Likud annex parts of the West Bank in order to preserve a veto on Likud sort of dismantling some of the safety mechanisms for the judiciary. These are two different battles, and he picked one of them so that he could ensure that he could hold the line there. And one of the things he managed to put into the annexation was American agreement, that Likud will not move forward on annexing anything in the West Bank or declaring it annexed. I don't know what a settlement that is completely controlled by Israel. Israelis live there, and today it's not annexed legally, but then Israel says it's annexed, but nobody in the world thinks it's annexed. I don't know what the difference is, but America would have to, the White House, the Trump administration, would have to openly, publicly, formally agree that Israel do that annexation for it to happen. And that's very, very interesting. It's kind of, Gantz kicked the ball to Washington. And in Washington, there's a debate happening in the Trump White House, in as much as there's any kind of coherent policy at all. There's a debate happening there on the question of Israel and on the question of annexation, because the Trump White House produced this peace plan, if you remember. It feels like I'm talking about history of 25 years ago, the Trump peace plan. But it produced this peace plan that it wants buy-in from a whole host of Arab governments and allies, and it wants the moderate Sunni Arab world, which is siding with Israel in the great grand strategic war with Iran in the region, to sign in, to buy into its peace plan. It wants the Palestinians to become unmoored, a little bit detached from their old commitments and their old refusals and their old rejections, so that things can move forward. At the same time, it's giving Israel massive victories in the peace plan that make it a little harder for the Palestinians to do it. It's a very complicated thing, and they want some buy-in from the region. And in order to get buy-in from the region, Israel has to not annex very fast. And so you saw when the peace plan was moving forward late last year, when it was announced, the whole big drama, that David Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, said, well, that's it, Israel, go ahead, annex whatever the peace plan, says you could already have, 30% of the West Bank, whatever it is, go for it. Nothing is stopping you. And the next day or 2 days later, Jared Kushner gives an interview, I believe on ABC, in which he says, we hope the Israelis won't move ahead with any annexations at this moment, because give the Palestinians 3 years to learn the thing, give the Saudis 10 months to think about it, give all these kinds of new kinds of schedules. So it's very interesting right now. Benny Gantz, I think, is hoping that Washington will rein in Likud. Likud is very, very eager to push forward some sort of annexation while Trump is still in power to approve it. I have to tell you that in Israel, we think, and that's shared on both sides of the aisle in Israel, that Trump is losing the election in November. And we think it because the response to the coronavirus crisis has been, to us, astoundingly bad, astoundingly ridiculously bad. Not a culture war question where, is abortion this or is abortion that? Not, it was fake, and it was lies, and it was incompetence, and it was a complete misreading of the situation. We Israelis, we have right-wing populists, and we have socialist challengers to the right-wing populists. And we have all of the things, and we have politics that are vengeful and angry and, bitter and all of the different things. And we have lies in our political campaigns and everything you can imagine. But at the end of the day, if Bibi Netanyahu is prime minister or Benny Gantz is prime minister, those are both very competent people who are prime minister, and they both can run a crisis, and they both are experienced and learned and thoughtful and read books and do all these things that change for us the equation. In other words, we don't feel a sense of, the Israelis don't feel like there are going to be 10,000 deaths because one wins the election or one loses the election. And we think that therefore, in our terms, if Donald Trump was our president, Donald Trump would have lost the election now. In fact, he would already be out of power because from his response to the coronavirus a month ago, the Knesset would have voted him, no confidence vote in him, and would have kicked him out of power. So Likud thinks that Donald Trump is going to lose the November election. And what that means is that if they want to annex something, they're not going to annex anything under a Joe Biden presidency. And if they're not going to annex under a Joe Biden presidency, they have until November to annex. And so this is something that's very urgent. And we have to now see if Trump lets it go forward. I'm going to stop talking. Maybe somebody thought of a question.
So under annexation, does the Knesset have to vote on that, or can the Prime Minister do that unilaterally?
It's not clear. It's not clear legally. When Israel applied civil law to East Jerusalem after the '67 war, and then when it applied civil law to the Golan Heights, that was done first by the government and by a government decision in the cabinet, and then by a law in the Knesset. It's not clear there will be a law in the Knesset because it's not clear how you structure the law. The far right of Israeli politics wants all of the West Bank. Most of Israeli politics extending to the left into the Labor Party, wants the major blocks, the Clinton parameters. The White House, the Democratic White House also wants Israel to have the major blocks. It just wants it at the end of the process, not at the beginning of the process. So everybody wants some of the West Bank. How do you structure a law that explains, as a matter of principle, that some is, but some isn't? It's shifting it from a disputed, belligerent occupation. I don't mean belligerent occupation as a moral epithet. I mean a legal structure called belligerent occupation in the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is what Israel has going in the West Bank. It's a system of responsibilities that a power has when it takes a territory that contains people who are not its civilians. That system has to then be transferred into a system of civilian law, while the rest of the territory isn't. How do you exactly structure that in law isn't clear. Writing a little government, declaration that, any part of Israel in which Israelis live any part of the West Bank in which Israelis live now functionally for Israeli civil law counts as Israel, is very, very simple. So it looks like there's going to be a government decision. Likud has a huge majority in the government for that. They probably will have a majority if they want to pass a law, but they're going to get into all kinds of complicated things. One important point is, I think we're going to see, I suspect, again, I'm not sure, a little bit of this is the tail wagging the dog. Netanyahu needs to hold together a right-wing coalition, so he needs the edge of that coalition to stay with him, or he loses ground against Gantz. And therefore, he has been much more right-wing over the last year than he's ever been in the history of his political career. So if this is classic Netanyahu, he will do something symbolic in annexation. He will try and push annexation of areas within the Clinton parameters, for example. And he'll say, why not? I mean, Bill Clinton thinks this is kosher. What, Bill Clinton wants after, I want before. But if that's the only difference, right, I'm not such a war criminal. He's going to try and push something like that, and then he's going to sit back and watch the international response. And if the international response is, we're all dealing with the coronavirus, none of us have any, bandwidth right now to look at what you're doing at Benjamin Netanyahu and at the Palestinians and all of that crazy nuttiness, then they'll probably move ahead with more annexation. And if the international response is dramatic and big and serious and the Trump administration is put on the defensive, then they probably won't. I just noticed the chat. I apologize, everyone. Now I know where that is. I've only done this about 14 times, so here. Charlie, what do I mean when I say left? I mean the old big Israeli left. Labor, but in 1992, when Yitzhak Rabin won the election at the head of Labor, Labor had 44 seats. It was 1/3 of parliament, was just the party, and Meretz, farther to the left, had 12 more seats. I mean the left writ large. Those people stopped voting left, but don't stop thinking their ideals haven't changed, but they no longer have a political vehicle to express them. Benny Gantz managed to build that political vehicle. What parties seem to be part of the coalition? Meitav. Meitav, my heart goes out to you. I can't imagine what it's like not to be home right now in this crisis. If you give me just 10 seconds, I will be able to open up.
Just following this,
please.
I wonder if you think this kind of diverse government can really last for years, or what's the future you see for this kind of government?
Yeah, if Bibi Netanyahu will have 77 members of Knesset. He'll be very stable. Benny Gantz actually gives him a real powerful benefit, which is that he has so many seats now he can ignore the right. In other words, what happens if Yamina, which is very right-wing, wants annexation, a maximalist annexation? What happens if Yamina says, "Oh, Bibi, you've turned soft on us," and drops out of the coalition? Now, with 61 seats, a 61-seat majority and 120, Netanyahu has to cater to their every whim, right, of the far right. With Gantz, Netanyahu can tell them, "Okay, I'll see you guys in 2 years. Maybe you'll be relevant again," right? So Gantz is someone, Bibi wants a government with Gantz. He also wants to preserve his right-wing support in a future election, whether it's in a year and a half or 3 years or 6 years, well, 4 years, right? But he wants to preserve that. So he wants to appear to be very right-wing while having all the levers he can have over the right. So I think Bibi will have an interest in keeping this coalition going as long as he can. But there is a moment, of course, the big thing about the agreement, somebody's making a lot of noise, I'm sorry. The big thing about this agreement is that they're going to rotate. Bibi is going to be prime minister until the end of September or the beginning of October. I have to check the exact dates, 2021, 18 months. And then Benny Gantz will be prime minister for the next 18 months. And there are a lot of people suggesting that Bibi Netanyahu might find a reason to go to new elections in about 17 and a half months, right? So one of the things that Benny Gantz negotiated into the coalition agreement, again, never been done before. This man, I am very impressed. A lot of people have said very mean things about Benny Gantz, like some kind of, he's an idiot, he's a fool, and Bibi's spinning him around his little finger. But when you dig down into details, you find a quiet, extremely competent man. And then when you step back a little bit and you read his Wikipedia resume, you discover that the man once rose to become the head of the Israeli army. So presumably he's not, the dumbest, what did they say, something about a knife in a drawer? He's not that knife. Benny Gantz worked into the coalition agreement that whoever has less time as prime minister when the government falls and we go to elections is the interim prime minister. And that's very interesting. because in Israel, to be interim prime minister is not a very powerful position, but you are prime minister in every way. And there's some limits. You can't, I don't know, you can't declare war on your own if you're interim prime minister, waiting for an election, things like that. But most of your powers are there. You can work on budgets. You can work on most of the powers of a prime minister. What that means is if Netanyahu calls an early election to prevent Benny Gantz from becoming prime minister, Benny Gantz still becomes prime minister. And he becomes prime minister for the 90 days it takes to to the election, to election day, the 90-day campaign. And then between another month or 2 months of various periods the president takes to negotiate, and the coalition negotiations and the talks and the actual swearing in of the next government. So he'll be prime minister for about 5 months no matter what. Will he also be prime minister for a year and a half is the big question. So this is two very talented, clever, intelligent politicians who have really been negotiating their way around it. And I am very impressed. Most Israelis are very angry and upset. Let me tell you the answer on the coalition question that you asked. The coalition, if it bears out, will be exactly as follows. Likud 36 seats, blue and white 15 seats, blue and white hangers on, the Labour Party 2 seats, Derech Eretz from Telem, from the old blue and white coalition, 2 seats, Yamina 6, United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazi Haredim 7, and Shas 9. That's a total of 77. Who's in the opposition? Yesh Atid and Telem. The rest of blue and white before Benny Gantz split off, that's 16. The joint list of the Arab parties, 15. Israel Beitenu, the Russian speakers, 7. And Meretz and 1 member of Labor, Merav Michaeli, who left the 2 Laborites who were going with Gantz into the Netanyahu government, which is 4. And then Orly Levy Abukassis from Gesher, which is 1. It's not clear she'll be in the coalition. She might. Nobody's counting her, depending on her. That's 42. 77 coalition, 42 opposition, and Gesher, this 1 person in between. That's the government, very, very stable and strong. Any questions before I go to the next one on the list in the chat? That's what parties are in the coalition. What about Netanyahu's indictment? Yes, Netanyahu's indictment is a lot of the background. It's a lot of the elephant in the room. I'm not going to say the elephant in the room because everyone's talking about it, but it's what's behind a lot of the pressure on Netanyahu. One of the things Benny Gantz can do as speaker is blue and white has already tabled, proposed, put on the agenda of the plenary a couple of different bills that would make it very hard for Netanyahu to serve as prime minister. One of them says that a member of Knesset under indictment can't serve as prime minister, so Netanyahu can't serve as prime minister. A couple of other bills tackle it from different directions, and it gets a little bit technical. But the sum total of it is that if they can advance these bills in the Knesset, there is probably a majority in the Knesset. If Netanyahu can't form a coalition with Gantz, there might be a majority in the Knesset for passing these bills and changing who can be prime minister, or at least limiting it to people who are not currently under indictment, which is already the standard for non-prime minister members of the government, of the cabinet. But for the prime minister is a little bit more protected in law and can be under indictment. So the indictment is a lever that Gantz has used very, very intelligently. The biggest threat facing Netanyahu is not from the high court because he has an indictment, it's from legislation, and Gantz controls the legislative agenda. So that's part of becoming speaker. In that sense, as a political tool, it's been very useful. What happens to his trial? His trial is currently frozen by the coronavirus crisis. It's probably going to come back in, fairly in a few months and begin in earnest. It'll probably go through all of the various stages of the trial. His lawyers will do their very best to extend it for as long as possible and to drag it out. And then there'll be a verdict, and there'll be a sentencing, and there'll be an appeal. And Netanyahu will be prime minister or will be deputy acting prime minister, whatever that non-prime minister position is of the one after the rotation. When he will come to Gantz and he will say, I want parliamentary immunity. You denied it to me a couple months ago, right, going into the March election, but now we're partners, and so I want immunity now. he might get that immunity. The other thing that might happen is he'll appeal to the Supreme Court. He has the right of appeal. And then they'll have to work through the Supreme Court, and that could be a whole nother trial of a couple of years, potentially. Olmert had a corruption trial. He was not prime minister, and his corruption trial still took a couple of years. And so Netanyahu, while he's prime minister, will have a lot of excuses to tell the court, I'm really busy on Tuesday, right? And just make it stretch out for quite a long time. So it'll be there in the background. It'll be a lever that Benny Gantz holds over Netanyahu. I don't think we're going to see him, go to prison. If he is convicted in the Supreme Court, by law, by basic law, by one of our constitutional laws, he cannot serve as prime minister. By then, it will be long, long into Benny Gantz's rotation. And Debbie, who are the most critical of Benny Gantz for going with Bibi Netanyahu? One of the people who have been extremely critical of Benny Gantz and think that my admiration of the man's political talents is misplaced and unconscionable is my boss, David Horowitz, the editor of the Times of Israel. And I'll say this about my boss. I have worked for him when he was editor of the Jerusalem Post, and he then founded the Times of Israel, and I worked for him at the Times of Israel. I worked for him for about 14 of the last 16 years. He put his op-ed right at the top of the site, explaining that Benny Gantz is just an immoral, unconscionable, terrible man who betrayed us all. And then he put my piece explaining that Benny Gantz is actually very, very talented political operator who is currently playing high-level four-dimensional chess with the greatest four-dimensional political chess player that we have ever known, Benjamin Netanyahu, and doing so successfully right next to his op-ed. So there is a huge debate. I wrote that Benny Gantz has managed to play a weaker hand than Netanyahu, but use everything, every little sliver of leverage very, very well. And I got my dad very angry. My dad, as he gets older, gets more left-wing. And he started out as a Meretz parliamentary aide in the 70s. So he's been getting very, very left-wing lately. And he's very angry at Benny Gantz. You see a lot of people in Yesh Atid, his partners that he abandoned to go with Netanyahu, who essentially said, Benny Gantz, you're just an idiot. I mean, you're criminally stupid because you think that Netanyahu isn't cheating and lying to you. Obviously, he's lying and cheating. Look at every person who has ever worked with Benjamin Netanyahu. And by the way, if you look at every person who's ever worked with Benjamin Netanyahu, you will find one very, very long list of people who despise Benjamin Netanyahu. I'll give you an example. There's a political party in Israel today headed by Benjamin Netanyahu's former political aide. It's called Yamina. His name is Naftali Bennett. And he hates deeply, passionately Benjamin Netanyahu. And there's another political party run by Netanyahu's former political aide, Israel Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman, hates Benjamin Netanyahu. Ayelet Shaked of Yamina was a political aide to Benjamin Netanyahu, very, very much dislikes Benjamin Netanyahu. Two members of Knesset from Telem, Bogi Ya'alon's party that were part of Blue and White and are now a little bit of a right-wing, pulled out and formed something called Derech Eretz and are now going with Benny Gantz into the Netanyahu coalition. Tzvika Hauser and Yoaz Hendel. Tzvika Hauser was Netanyahu's cabinet secretary, maybe the most senior political appointment that a prime minister makes. Does not like Benjamin Netanyahu and ran in the party whose sole job was to oust Benjamin Netanyahu. Yoaz Hendel was a spokesman for Benjamin Netanyahu, very impressive guy, was a naval commando, has a PhD in Greek military history and ancient Greek military history, very impressive guy, Netanyahu's spokesman, and then was kicked out because he was kicked out of Netanyahu's office, of the prime minister's office, because he was a whistleblower when one of Netanyahu's political aides sexually harassed another one of his employees. And also despises Netanyahu. So the Knesset is full of people who feel cheated. I'm talking about the right. The left dislike Netanyahu for other reasons. The right deeply personally dislike Netanyahu. And it's true across almost the entirety of the Israeli right. You just now had a party called Kulanu. It was 10 members of Knesset in in the 2015 election. It's it was headed by a former Likud minister called Moshe Kachlon, who left Likud because he felt Netanyahu was keeping him down, keeping him from advancing. The man who just challenged Netanyahu in the primaries, Gideon Sa'ar, feels that Netanyahu is a burden on the Israeli right. So he's surrounded by people who dislike him and who feel that he is very, predatory and very difficult. And all of them are right. I mean, Netanyahu is a very problematic person personally. I had a debate on a panel with the right-wing spokesperson, and they said that all of the corruption, investigations into Netanyahu are ridiculous. These are not crimes. This is the prosecutors are persecuting the prime minister. And I said, okay, well, you know what? How about this? Let's agree on this. Let's agree that these things that the prime minister is alleged to have done are not crimes. Let's in fact agree that only what the prime minister says happened is what happened. In other words, let's completely take Netanyahu's view on case 1000, case 2000, case 4000. There's no reason you guys should know the details, but they involve negotiating with a publisher of a newspaper to give him better coverage. In exchange, he will turn to a right-wing newspaper that supports him and to their owner of that newspaper, Sheldon Adelson, and get him to shut down the rival newspaper, throwing hundreds of journalists out of work. It involves negotiating better coverage and harassing constantly editors of a website called Walla, a very popular website in Israel, for better coverage, and his wife doing so constantly. And the owner of that website saying, look, he's the prime minister, let's change the story a little bit so that, I can talk to the prime minister. I'm the owner of this website. I'm also the owner of a controlling share of the largest telecom company in Israel. If you go by Netanyahu's version of things, he is deeply immoral and plays games with journalists constantly and at a strategic level, and is willing to shut down newspapers that support him to convince newspapers that don't support him to cover him more nicely. In other words, Netanyahu comes off as a very bad person, even if nothing is criminal in any of these actions. And the attorney general that he appointed, a right-wing religious man, who was also his cabinet secretary before he appointed him attorney general, believes that there are actual crimes, including bribery, in these actions. So Netanyahu faces, Netanyahu is not a well-liked man. And we have interesting surveys where we say, do you want to drink a beer with him? And the answer is, of course not. Do you think he could be prime minister? And the answer is, look, he's a competent manager of the economy. He was probably right on Iran when the whole world was against him, including the White House. There are all these reasons to like Netanyahu, even if you don't like him. So Netanyahu wants, I think, going back to the point about the large coalition, I think he wants a coalition with blue and white that sort of neutralizes a lot of those people who dislike him. That was to the question, why are people critical of Benny Gantz? People don't like Netanyahu, is why they're critical of Benny Gantz. Let me open it up before reading the next question. Okay. Balance.
What happened? So Lieberman, when this whole thing started, it seemed like Lieberman, left Netanyahu because he was upset about the religious right not in the army. What happened to that whole issue? Where does that stand with this new coalition?
Nobody needs Lieberman anymore. Once Bibi and Gantz have the numbers, Lieberman's irrelevant. Lieberman was the kingmaker. He could claim, he could deny government, he could force Netanyahu to beg. Now that Netanyahu has Gantz, nobody needs Lieberman. Those issues are going to be sold to the Haredi parties because they're the ones in the game. Benny Gantz will hold the line on some of them, but there'll be no real change in the status quo. In other words, the ultra-Orthodox won't be able to expand limits on, I don't know what businesses on Shabbat in Tel Aviv, but they won't be able to open more businesses on Shabbat in Tel Aviv over the course of the next government. The Haredim remain in control of religious issues.
Haviv, I'm going to jump in real quick just because I know it's getting to dinner time and everything in Israel. I want to make sure you're okay on time to still take a couple of questions.
I have to go in 5 minutes
Okay.
for another Zoom call with the Israel Democracy Institute about whatever the heck is happening tonight. But 5 minutes, and
So I see that
Yeah.
Herman Markel asked a question on the chat. Maybe we'll address that. And then if you have anything, any closing you want to say or whichever it is, and we can go from there.
Some balance between secular and ultra-Orthodox in relation to agreements, in relation to the coalition agreements. So first of all, the coalition agreement is essentially a legal contract. No court has ever enforced it. Courts are very, very skittish about enforcing agreements between politicians. The politicians should be able to agree to things and then lie. It's part of the process. In other words, if you start holding politicians legally to account for their lies, you probably end up with worse policy than if you let them pretend they'll do something, but then they get into power and do something else. Courts have not enforced it, but it is still a legal contract, and when it's written down, it has a lot of public force. I haven't seen the documents themselves. They are going to be every combination of two parties signs an agreement between them, and sometimes they stretch into 60 pages. Sometimes they're very short and simple. Sometimes they stretch into many, many pages, and very specific things on bills, and on there are copies of bills attached in the coalition agreement, things like that. So I haven't seen the details, but I can tell you that the key word, I think, is balance. The Israeli political system, really the heart and soul of Israeli democracy, is a kind of balancing act between Israel's society is very, very fractured and very tribal. It's divided into tribes that don't speak to each other very well and don't live with each other. So the ultra-Orthodox live largely separate lives. I don't encounter them. And even the secular and just the modern Orthodox generally live in sort of separate lives. The Arabs are divided into several societies and subcultures. The Bedouin in the south, who are very, very conservative, the Bedouins in the south have no connection to the educated Christian Arabs in the north. They all meet in the Knesset. And there is this idea in the Knesset called the status quo, which is really fundamental to understanding the Israeli psyche. The status quo is not a specific status quo. It is a word, Israelis pronounce it status quo, and it is a term used by Israelis to describe a situation in which no tribe, none of these political groups and cultural groups and religious groups and ethnic groups, all of whom are represented by their own political party, none of them have a majority in themselves. There's never been a single party that's had a majority in parliament, not since 1949, in the first election. And none of them oppress the others. In other words, Israeli democracy is not constructed of a separation of powers in any constitutional document. There was no Philadelphia Convention. There was no explicit discussion of democracy at Israel's founding. It's not at all clear how Israel became a democracy. In other words, a lot of people sort of assume, not just you guys, a lot of people around the world just sort of assume that Israelis are a bunch of American Jews with suntans, but in fact, Israelis are not American Jews. Israelis come, half of them from the Arab and Muslim world. The other half come from very non-democratic parts of Europe in very non-democratic periods. And Israelis, the first time that something like 98% of Israelis had ever voted was their first time voting in Israel. So you have a population that had never seen democracy, has no texts and documents and founding, right? There are rights, by the way, that we still haven't legislated. They don't exist in Israeli law, not because we don't have those rights, but because nobody put them in a law ever. For example, free speech, freedom of the press, equality. We can sue each other for discrimination. You could sue for discrimination, but there's no right to equality. You sue for discrimination because there's something called the right to dignity that nobody knows what it means. We have in Israel all kinds of, we're a very half-baked democracy. We have the simplest electoral system in the world. The whole country is a single constituency. We don't even divide the population in any way to create different houses of parliament that can rein each other in. It's an incredibly simple, incredibly non-thought-through democracy with no democratic tradition. And yet it is a democracy. And yet it has been liberalizing over the decades. Israel today is a whole different Israel in terms of liberalism than what it was in the 60s or the 80s or even the 90s. And all of that is based on this balance. And all of that is to say, the ultra-Orthodox, the status quo says and it's implicit. It's one of these things so fundamental to a society that you don't talk about it. If you have to talk about it, you're not part of that society. The status quo says that the ultra-Orthodox can run themselves. They get their own school system. They get their own towns. They get their own weird relationship with the rest of the country that they themselves don't entirely understand. As long as they don't impose themselves on others. So for example, the ultra-Orthodox control the Israeli rabbinate. They control the word kosher. If you are a restaurant and you say that something is kosher because God came to you in a dream, or actual Moses actually came back from the dead and told you it was kosher, that's illegal in Israel. There's only one place in the world where a rabbi who is not approved by the government tells you that something is kosher in their opinion is illegal, and that place in the world is Israel. But also, anyone can say anything they want. In other words, there's this restrictive Ottoman Empire religious infrastructure here in Israel. Jews can only marry in the rabbinate. There's no civil marriage. But because there's no civil marriage, there's this thing that's developed over the decades called Yeduim B'Tzibur, which is essentially common law marriage, which gays have had since the 90s. In other words, in Israel, gays since the 90s have been able to live together, share a bank account, adopt children, make end-of-life decisions for each other, sue each other for alimony when they break up. That is to say, all of the actual rights and responsibilities of marriage without calling it marriage. Through this sort of common law, if you live together and have a sexual relationship, you're married. So we have the most restrictive religious personal status law in the free world, and also one of the least restrictive because nobody listens to it. The status quo is essentially the idea that the secularists don't get to tell the ultra-Orthodox what to teach their kids. The ultra-Orthodox don't get to actually prevent us from eating whatever we want and doing whatever we want on Shabbat. They just get to pretend to prevent us. If they actually try to enforce it, the whole system collapses. The status quo is essentially all of the different groups of Israeli society, all at loggerheads all the time, but nobody ever gets to win. And if anyone looks like they're starting to win, they call in all the other groups to stop whatever group is trying to win. So I'll give you an example of this right now. Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to pass laws into the coalition agreement having to do with something called the Kamenetz Law. And with this I have to go, but it's a really interesting sort of opening into, and the Kamenetz Law upped enforcement of illegal building. Arab communities in Israel don't get enough building permits. Israelis, not in the West Bank, not Palestinians, Israeli Arabs don't get enough building permits. And they build illegally. And there's a big debate. Do they build illegally because they don't get enough permits? Or is it hard to give them permits because they don't submit paperwork because they just build illegally? It's one of these chicken and egg things where the subtext, of course, is Israel racist, or are the Arabs not cooperating with the law and the state? So it's a very, very tense and problematic debate. And the Kamenetz Law upped enforcement over the last 3 years, and the Arabs are very keen on removing the Kamenetz Law, and they told Benny Gantz, we will recommend you for prime minister, which they did, if that's part of what you do. You rescind this law that upped enforcement. And Benjamin Netanyahu fought tooth and nail against this because the right wing wants law enforcement, and the Arabs can't get away with breaking the law all the time and all of this kind of rhetoric. And then the ultra-Orthodox stepped in. And the ultra-Orthodox said to Netanyahu, whoa, 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 ease up on the Arabs. This whole question of the Kamenetz Law, we're your allies, Netanyahu. We're going with you in this coalition negotiations. But this whole question of the Arabs is going to be put to the side. We're not going to gang up on the Arabs right now. Now, the ultra-Orthodox are not, great liberals. They're not worried about prejudice against the Arabs. They're worried that the right thinks that he can now beat up Arabs. Well, guess what? Yesh Atid is going to join a coalition in a couple of years, and then what do you think the secularists of Yesh Atid are going to be doing? They're going to be doing exactly that kind of ganging up on the ultra-Orthodox. And so the ultra-Orthodox in Israel and the Arabs in Israel have this alliance in which they despise each other, and they often say racist things about each other. I mean, they often, like this week, and both sides have said racist things about each other. But when the secularists on the right or the secularists on the left beat up one of them, they both jump in to help. Is kind of how our democracy works. We're a very strange place. So I think that you're going to see much of the same. You're going to see the secularists and the ultra-Orthodox largely neutralized. Neither will really advance anything significant. The only real movement has been on issues that are right-left issues, which is to say annexation and the judiciary. I still haven't seen the actual text. Once there's a text also, the government has to actually function. And we'll see how that works. I suspect Benny Gantz will impress us once again. I have been very impressed with his prowess. I don't think you should, vote for him. I'm not for him. I'm just saying he is as intelligent as Netanyahu at maneuvering in this very, very complicated place called Israeli politics. And so we're going to have two very, very competent and serious people. First of all, managing the coronavirus crisis, the economic fallout, and then getting on with some of our culture wars. Once this crisis gets out of the way, we can all finally get back to fighting our culture wars that we love so much. And the secular religious issues, I think, are going to be delayed at least until the next election. Whether that's in a year and a half or in 3 years, I can't tell you.
Thank
So
you.
that was it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you so much.